I want you to understand how special a country you and I share. I think we take that for granted. I really do. I really believe that sometimes those of us in this country believe that America is the greatest country on earth because God loves us more than he loves the rest of the world. That is not true. We are the greatest country in the history of the world because of the sacrifices and decisions that were made by those who were entrusted with leadership in it before. And you have an obligation to ensure that. It is not guaranteed. And I give you that insight from someone who interacts with people on a daily basis. I know people criticize America. I know there are things wrong with this country. I know there is. I'll give you one brief example. I remember growing up, but people use this as an example of what's wrong with this country. In 1980, growing up in Las Vegas, I remember neighborhood kids taunting my parents during the Mariel refugee about Europe, a bunch of Cubans, why don't you go back home, why don't you go back to Cuba. I remember that. But that's not reflective of America. They may be Americans, but that is not America. It never has been. Because for every one of those instances, I can give you the example of my parents who drove from New York to Florida and broke down in the deep South. Didn't know anyone, didn't even know English. And they couldn't stop the number of people that came out and helped them in 1961 to take that broken down car and getting it fixed without any money in their pocket. True story. For every negative story that I could give you, and there aren't that many, there are so many that reflect the greatness of our people. I want you to understand that it's more than just that. I interact with people all the time from all over the world. Living in Miami, that's just the way it is. And there are things about us they don't like, but I can tell you they admire this country so much because they see the best in them in us. They see people with names like them, who look like them, who came from the place they came from, doing things that they didn't think was possible. And it's more than that. The rest of the world, do you understand self-governance, the notion that people could actually govern their own affairs, that power came from, that your rights came from God and not from a king, is a 200-year-old idea. The enormous majority of human beings have never lived under a system that would allow something like that. And around the world, that's still commonplace. So anytime someone in an oppressed part of the world or even in an emerging democracy wonders, can we make it work? Is it possible for there truly to be democracy and freedom in a republic where we live? All they got to do is look to America and they see it. And you want the evidence of that? When was the last time you read about a boatload of American refugees arriving some other place? Why aren't we building a fence to keep Americans out of Canada? There's a reason. There are things wrong with America, but it is our obligation to ensure it and protect it for the next generation. That is the greatest American inheritance. Every generation of American has left for their children a better country, a better life than their own. I hope this generation of leadership will not be the first to fail. I don't believe we will. The other day people were talking about President Kennedy. My favorite Kennedy speech is one he never gave. The speech he would have given had he lived one day more. Let me tell you what he was going to say. I hope I brought it. I did. This is what he was going to say in the closing of the speech. And tell me these words don't ring true today as much as they ever have. He wrote, "We in this country, in this generation are, by destiny, rather than by choice, the watchmen on the walls of world freedom. We ask, therefore, that we may be worthy of our power and responsibility, that we may exercise our strength with wisdom and restraint, and that we may achieve in our time and for all time the ancient vision of peace on earth, goodwill towards men. That must always be our goal, and the righteousness of our cause must always underlie our strength. For as was written long ago, except the Lord keep the city, the watchman waketh but in vain." These words are truer today than they have ever been. And they speak out to us from across 3 decades, from a slain president who never got to give it. Do not ever forget the greatness of America. Our greatness doesn't come from our army, nor from the size of our borders, but from the compassion of our people and a commitment to self-government and the rights of all men. And that I hope will never change. 90 miles from the shores of our very state are men and women of my ancestry and heritage who still do not have that. But they look to this country for the hope that they one day will. We cannot fail them, because if we do, we will fail the world. And we are an example of that democracy and that republic. And that's why when you see me with a smile when I walk in here, when Representative Booker gets up and asks another question, and you may be irritated sometimes, it doesn't irritate me as much as it should. You know why? Representative Booker, with all due respect, you know why it doesn't irritate me? Because in Cuba they can't do that. And I know I'm in America when Representative Booker and others stand up and question what we're doing. And it makes me proud. Let me finish with one more thought. And this one is just the truth, and I hope no one gets offended, no one should. And that is this. God is real. God is real. I don't care what courts across this country say. I don't care what laws we pass. God is real. You can't pass a court ruling that's going to keep God out of this building. You can't. Because God doesn't care about the Supreme Court of Florida. I mean, he doesn't care. He cares, but he doesn't care. You know what I mean? He cares about them, but he doesn't care about their rulings, and he doesn't care about the Supreme Court of the United States. You can't keep him out. He doesn't want you to force him down anyone's throat, by the way. But God is not some old man with a big white beard that just kind of hovers over the world and makes us feel good from time to time. God is a real force of love. Let me tell you what a real force of love is. He loves every human being on earth. Whether you are an embryo or behind bars, whether you got here, he doesn't care if you have a visa to be legally in this country. He loves you. He doesn't care, and please don't take this wrong, he doesn't care if you committed the most heinous act that violated the laws of man. He loves you. He doesn't care if you're so small you can't even see it, but with a microscope. He loves you. You have never met a human being that God does not love, and you never ever will. And it's more than that. It's more than that. God doesn't just love every human being he ever did. God, you can see it. Because I have seen it. You know where I've seen it? I've seen it in a hospice nurse that when she's off duty, stays all night with a patient. Doesn't have to, but she does. Because she doesn't want an old lady to die by herself. Because no relatives have come to see her. You may chalk that up to that person's goodness. But I'm telling you that does not happen if it wasn't for the love of God.